Well, welcome to the breakout session 1B. Maybe we get gradually started. So we have a very exciting morning already, and then hopefully we will continue in this breakout session. And then this is a session on what sustainable transportation opportunities contributes to increasing equity. So this morning we have already seen the plenary session about how investing in sustainable transportation could potentially lead to unintended consequences of inequity and then so on. So essentially, we want to continue the discussion a little bit and then really try to see how opportunities could be counterproductive or maybe productive regarding equity issues. So my name is Yanfeng Yang. I'm a professor at Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Urbana-Champaign, and I'm also associate director for Illinois Center for Transportation on the Urbana campus. I'm very excited to be here to moderate this, attend first of all, to be part of this workshop and also to moderate this session. I would like to mention that we do have a scribe for this session, Dr. P.S. Suraj. He is in the audience, and then he is actually director of the Urban Transportation Center here at the UIC, and also he's director of the Metropolitan Transportation Support Initiative and the research programs. As you probably have seen from the agenda, that this session we have 4 very distinguished speakers, and we are going to be trying to address some of the questions here. We have seen all these wonderful, wonderful opportunities ahead of us, but then we also realize that the opportunities comes at a cost, and then potentially could be counterproductive. And then we wanted to know, particularly, can the transition to sustainable transportation be really a good opportunity for equity improvements or not? Essentially, particularly, we heard about the costs associated with the investments. We talk about different communities maybe actually seeing it differently, and then their behavior might be different, their needs are different. How do we address those? And then also when we have this transition to sustainable transportation, to this type of investment, really we are now having this opportunity to reconsider infrastructure, reconsider behavior. But then sometimes we could actually do damage, or maybe sometimes we could actually sort of unintended damages. And particularly, we have been alluding to this throughout since yesterday to today, that the urban and rural communities are very, very different. And then what happens in Chicago is very different from what happens in Urbana-Champaign, for example. And then how, the needs are very different, and the way of living is very different. And then the just demand density or population density leads to very different solutions that we need to devise. So we particularly mentioned about this rural versus urban, that we need to really, when we talk about inequality and equity issues, we really need to pay that attention. And also, particularly for some of these investments, where do we really prioritize the funding, and then where do we invest, where do we allocate our resources? That's again, keep that in mind a little bit. And also, particularly this morning, our plenary session talked about the cost has been going down, but maybe we wish it would be even faster, right, than what is happening already. But then until that cost goes to really affordable for everybody, and how do we prioritize our investment, and how do we really exploit the economies of scale that may actually happen, and how fast can that happen? Our speaker mentioned about, ultimately everybody should benefit from this transition, but then the path could be different. So we really need to pay attention to that. So with this, I think we want to keep these questions in your mind a little bit, and then when you hear our four very distinguished speakers. I would like to maybe briefly mention, I introduce our speakers. We will have 4 speakers from sort of representing different stakeholders in the puzzle, I would say. We have speakers from the local communities. We have speakers talking about sort of more like cities, and then some representing states or governments, and some representing academia. So we will try to show you sort of different perspectives of different stakeholders. And then we have about an hour for this session of a presentation. They prepare slides very graciously, and then they each will talk for about 12 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we will have 1 or 2 minutes of a transition period, and also clarification questions only for anybody who wants just to make sure that they understand everything in the slides. And then after we have these 4 speakers all talk, and then we will have about half an hour of an open discussion session. I'll be trying to monitoring the questions from the audience. Feel free to use the technology that has been introduced this morning. So some questions, I'll try to pass them out and then share, but feel free to raise your hand as well. Good. So why don't we just get started? And then, so we will get started with the first speaker, Jose Acosta Cordova. He's from the Transportation Justice Program. He's actually Transportation Justice Program Manager at the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. He leads the Transportation and Mobility Justice Program and works on issues related to freight, environmental justice, and mobility justice at the local, state, and the national levels. He's also the co-chair of the Transportation Equity Network in Chicago. He is currently pursuing PhD in UC, I believe, in geography. And then he's actually he very remarkable. He said he was raised by social justice activists and has been working on such issues since age of 3. So please join me in welcoming Jose. So let me get this ready.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with you all today and to share the work that we're doing at Envejo, and as well as talk about the issues that are happening across the country. So my presentation today is going to be focused on issues around freight and how we're thinking about equity and sustainability during this process of freight electrification. I always start with this picture of the Corwith Intermodal Rail Yard here locally, which is the largest rail yard within the city limits. And I'll talk more about this rail yard, but I always start with this picture because I think this is literally what represents freight in Chicago, right? At one time, or is the oldest rail yard in the city, and at one time was the largest rail yard in the world when it was constructed in 1888. So I always like starting with this story because I think the story of what we're dealing with has origins in this rail yard. So freight electrification, or actually freight pollution, has become a really key issue for environmental justice communities across the country. Airport cargo is definitely an issue, but the 3 main issues that people are working on right now is really around the coastal seaports, right? The container ports, like the ports of LA and Long Beach, which is actually pictured here. Then rail yards, which is this is actually a picture of the Bedford Park rail yard here in the southwest side. And then diesel trucks, right? And trucks, of course, are like the common denominator between everything because they serve the ports, they serve the rail yards, they serve the airports, they serve warehouses. Really, the main mode of transportation, particularly what we're talking about inland distribution, is trucks. And, of course, they're all powered by diesel, which contributes to significant pollution across the country, across the world. And here in Illinois, transportation is actually our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. I apologize, some of these numbers are a little bit small, but on this bottom left is a chart that was created by the Respiratory Health Association, who we work closely with on a lot of this work. And this is actually called the Dirty Dozen Report, so I highly recommend checking out this report. It highlights pollution in the 12 largest counties in the state of Illinois, and actually all 12 of these counties are in the top 9% for the worst air pollution in the entire country. Cook County and DuPage County, folks that live in Cook County or DuPage County, you're in the top 1%. So you're literally breathing some of the worst air quality in the entire country. And the rest of the Chicago metro area is within the top 5%. So I know we've made news in recent years, particularly with the wildfires, but even before the wildfires, we were already breathing some of the worst air quality in the entire state. And a significant contribution of this is these diesel trucks, these medium and heavy-duty vehicles. On the top right is a graph that shows how 7% of the total on-road fleet are medium and heavy-duty vehicles, but they contribute 36% of greenhouse gases, 67% of NOx, and 59% of particulates. So you see just this very small percentage of the total fleet contributes to an overwhelming percentage of the actual pollution. So this is why it's such a major concern for us when we're talking about sustainability and we're talking about equity, and we're thinking about electrification. The primary goal for us, a primary concern, is freight, right? We're not thinking as much about passenger vehicles because we know that in our communities, right, that there's, number one, there's not the charging infrastructure, right? We don't have those charging stations yet, access and affordability to electric vehicles is still an issue. and especially when you have many communities that are predominantly multifamily housing, right? So I think that's important for folks to think about is when what EJ communities are pushing is really around freight, because that's what's most concerning to us. And then on this bottom right, shout out to my coworker Melanie, who also contributed on a number of these slides and who leads our state campaign around electrification and getting some of these rules adopted that I'm going to talk about. Came up with this figure here that shows on average 416 deaths a year in Illinois are because of diesel pollution. It costs Illinois residents about $4.6 billion annually in healthcare costs and other related costs. And there's over 40 cancer-causing substances in diesel pollution, right? So this is a major concern when we're talking about the impacts it's having on our communities. And the reason why this is such a major issue in Illinois is because we are the largest inland distribution hub in North America. There's a lot of text right here. I won't go through it all. But some key aspects to think about is that the reason why we are the largest is because this is the only place in North America where all 6 Class 1 railroads converge, right? Because of that, we have approximately 25% of intermodal 25% of all freight trains that come through Illinois, the Chicago area, and 50% of all intermodal trains that pass through our Chicago area. So it's a huge part of our local economy, right? Some of these highways carry over 30,000 trucks a day. We also have O'Hare, one of the fastest growing air cargo hubs in the world, and there's approximately 1.1 billion square feet of industrial space that's dedicated to manufacturing and freight, or manufacturing for freight and freight in general, which is actually the largest market in the U.S. And I said it's a huge part of our economy. 1 in 4 jobs in the Chicago area is in some way employed in freight, in some kind of transportation, distribution, logistics related industry, or directly in it. And we actually have over 15,000 transportation, distribution, and logistics companies in the Chicago area, which is also the most in the country. So it's it's a huge part of our economy, right? And I always actually call Chicago the inland port city, because a lot of times we don't think about Chicago as a port city because we're not located on the coast, right? We don't have a container port. We don't have those cargo ships coming from other parts of the world. We do have barges, of course, right? But when we think about ports and about global trade, we think about ports of LA and Newark and these other places. But we are in fact a port city based on the numbers and based on how many containers we're moving through Chicago every year. So just to give you a sense of that, in 2018, which is the largest ever recorded, we had almost 18 million 20-foot or equivalent containers, the TEUs, come through Chicago's 19 intermodal rail yards. And last year, or 2022, which is the most recent year that CMAP has numbers for, we had 16.5 million. So for context, that's actually just slightly under how many containers the ports of LA and Long Beach move collectively, and actually a lot more than the ports of Newark, New Jersey, or New Jersey, New York. So that actually makes us the second busiest port city by container volume in the country. And by the numbers, we'd actually be the 11th busiest in the world. So we actually move more containers through Chicago than the port of Rotterdam, right, the largest port in Europe. So how could we not be considered a port city when we're moving that many containers, right? And I mentioned we have 19 intermodals, right? These intermodal rail yards are actually also considered inland ports themselves, and actually was recently defined by the U.S. EPA as an inland port or a dry port. So that distinction is really critical, particularly when we're talking about funding, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And it is our most direct connection to global trade, right? So this is like really, I think the key thing is how would Chicago play a role in global economics? And it starts with these inland ports. And of course, they're primarily located in communities of color. What you see here on the left is the Latino population, and on the right is the African American population. And you see where these 19 intermodal rail yards are located. It's predominantly in communities of color, particularly within the city limits, where literally all 8 that are located within the city are in communities of color on the south and west sides. So of course, then we're the ones who are dealing with the pollution disproportionately. When you also consider the fact that warehouses and other freight and truck-intensive facilities also located as closely as possible to these rail yards, then what you have is highly concentrated pollution, highly concentrated centers of pollution across the region. And thankfully, we've been able to do some work to highlight what the impacts of that are locally. But I think that's really critical to think about. And The last thing I'll say about this is the reason what these intermodals are so important is because what happens here is these containers are brought directly from coastal ports via trains, right? They're transported here at these rail yards. They're transported then to a semi truck, who then takes it to a local warehouse or a distribution center. It's broken down, and then take it to a retailer, and then of course that's where we as consumers purchase it, right? So again, this is like our direct connection to global trade. And when you look at those maps and overlay them with these maps, this shows then what the public health impacts of that is. So on the left is a map, the cumulative impacts map that was created by National Resources Defense Council back in 2018, and it shows the cumulative burden of pollution and takes into, I think, 6 social demographic factors and 11 environmental factors, and came up with a methodology that showed where the most cumulative burden is in the city. On the right is a map that was created by the Chicago Department of Public Health, who used a similar methodology, slightly different, but came up with very similar results. So if you take a look at where industry is located, and especially where freight intensive or truck intensive facilities are located, then this map shows you what those impacts of that are public health wise. And then recently, of course, we talk about the data, right? A lot of the data that exists now is actually was created by communities or by our partners, right? Our allies, because there's been a severe lack of data when we talk about truck traffic, when we talk about pollution, when we talk about number of warehouses. And recently, actually, the Environmental Defense Fund, we also were part of the advisory board for this report, but they created a Illinois warehouse boom report that highlighted how many warehouses are currently leased in the state of Illinois. So the number that they were able to come up with was that there's just over 2,400 leased warehouses of over 100,000 square feet, and there's about 525,000 truck trips that serve these 2,400 warehouses every single day. Right, so you think about how many truck trips that is for a year. If that's just one day, you're talking about over 190 million estimated, right? So this is a major issue, not only here in the city, but across the state. And then there's 2 million people that live within a half mile of these warehouses. And if you're Latino, you're 195% more likely to live within a half mile. If you're African American, you're 137% more likely to live within a half mile. So again, this is happening not only here locally, but across the state. And then another thing that we created recently was we created a Chicago truck count data portal with Center for Neighborhood Technology, where we were able to over a 24-hour period set up cameras at 35 locations across the city and collect how many trucks went through that intersection every intersection for that entire 24-hour period. And the reason why, again, this is so important is because we knew that there was a major issue with truck traffic. We've been talking about it to anybody that would listen, Department of Planning, Department of Transportation, at every single level, Department of Public Health. And we all often didn't have the numbers to back it up. So doing this project and creating that was really crucial. And we saw that at one intersection in particular, just south of Little Village, is Pulaski and 41st, and there were 5,159 trucks that went through that intersection over a 24-hour period. So again, you start estimating what that is for a week, a month, a year. And then we try to go through this rest of this quickly. I'm running out of time. And then thankfully, there are some really good solutions that we're pushing across across the country. But everything really starts in California, right? These rules, the Advanced Clean Trucks rule, the Advanced Clean Fleets rule, and the Heavy Duty Omnibus Low NOx rule all came out of California. They're leading the way on this stuff, right? These rules are creating targets for electrification, creating requirements around zero emission vehicle sales. They're also creating increased regulations on existing diesel vehicles, and then of course they're requiring companies with like the ACF, for example, which is the most recent rule and is also the rule that was most centered in equity and community. Requires companies with over 50 trucks in their fleet to purchase electric vehicles over the next couple of decades, and also drayage trucks, drayage is a really critical element of this because those are the trucks that go between the ports and the rail yards all day, every day. They never leave the area that they operate in, and they're some of the oldest and dirtiest trucks on the road. So it's kind of low-hanging fruit to electrify those rapidly because they never leave, and they're not long-haul transport. So these rules are really critical, and there's a heavy focus in California right now and some other states around decarbonizing container ports in general. So that's really, really critical. And then just to add in some additional thing, I know I'm talking about trucks, but they're also currently working on applying for a waiver through the US EPA around locomotive electrification, which is also going to be really critical for Illinois going forward. And so the last couple of things is when we talk about equity, we also have to, aside from the pollution and issues around public health, we also have to be thinking about equity in the workplace, right? So there's going to be a huge opportunity for access to new employment as we talk about building these electric vehicles, whether passenger or commercial, right? These are really high quality jobs that we're anticipating, and then 2 million new jobs by 2035 in Illinois. This is really going to be critical across. That's 2 million jobs across the country. But yeah, this is going to be a really critical part, and thinking about the just transition element, right, is that we're always considering what happens to the workers, right? We talk about truck drivers that are electrifying their vehicles. How are we prioritizing them with rebates, especially folks that are owner independent operator who are contracted to do this work? How are we considering them? And then a really key thing is also supply chain equity. And I think this is one of the most critical things for us to think about as folks who are pushing electrification is what does it mean for mining practices in other parts of the world, right? We've seen a lot of videos coming up recently around the cobalt and lithium mining issues in Africa, especially cobalt in the Congo. So if we're an EJ community and the EJ organization, we have to be, and we're prioritizing equity, we have to be thinking about what it means for continued patterns of colonialism and imperialism that are going to continue to exacerbate the issue of poverty and exploitation of the global South. So I won't go into the details of this because I'm running out of time, but I think this is one of the most critical elements of this, so we can't continue these patterns. And lastly, it got messed up right there. So yeah, there's a bunch of economic benefits that are associated with the ACT in terms of how many billions of dollars it'll save Illinois community folks across the state. And I'm out of time, so let me just say that the last thing, there's a huge national effort here right now, and through federal funding. Well, recently the US EPA Clean Ports Program was established, and this is allocating $3 billion for the electrification of container ports, and 8% of that, $250 million for inland ports and dry ports, and that's actually a direct result of the work that we've been doing through Moving Forward Network, which is a national network made up of 50 organizations work in 20 different cities, all working on zero emission freight. And we were advocating to the US EPA along with our partners from Region 5 and others across the country that were saying we need to be thinking about rail yards in the ports because there's so many more rail yards than there are container ports, right? And they're just as dirty, have just as many issues with respect to impacts on the community. So we're really excited about that. We know folks here at the state are going for some of that clean port money. Recently, also the DOE and the DOT nationally created a zero emission freight corridor strategy, which is actually the map that you see here. This is the phase one. So they're basically creating, and thinking about long haul transport, which is kind of the biggest pressing issue in terms of how we fully electrify or fully decarbonize the sector, is how do we build out the network? So they're starting from like cities and regions, and then over time, over the next decade and a half or so, we're gonna continue to build out the infrastructure as it's needed. And then yeah, I mentioned our work through the Moving Forward Network. So we have a locomotive campaign where we're trying to really heavily focus on decarbonizing these rail yards. And of course, we're have some really important dates coming up. And here in Chicago, we're hosting a community meeting May 29th at 6 p.m. At the Arturo Velázquez Institute, where we're going to be talking about impacts of rail yards on the community. So folks are able to come out, and you'll be able to see all the information here on El Veco's social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We're not really active on Snapchat as much, but yeah, highly recommend you check out our work, and I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Now, let me just introduce our second speaker, Professor Sahiu. Did I pronounce it right? Castellanos. He is an assistant professor of civil architectural and environmental engineering at UT Austin. And then he is a mechanical engineer by training, I believe. And then he has been leading the RESET laboratory there at Austin, mostly analyzing decarbonization options for sustainable and equitable energy transition. And then he has been working interdisciplinary projects that actually received international recognition, and he recently received the 2023 Cesar Chavez Award for his transformative work helping better improve the communities in Austin. Today, actually, he will bring the academic perspective on some of the work he did regarding how Austin sort of transition to sustainable transportation and the impact on equity issues. So please join me in welcoming Satya. 1 second. Where's my mouse? This is you, right? I think. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Sergio Castellanos. I'll talk today about the theme of this presentation is opportunities to increase equitable outcomes, but I should clarify that this, the jury is still out. We're trying to work on increasing, whether that comes to fruition, still to be determined. I lead the RESET Lab and we work on equitable energy transitions. I'm coming from UT Austin, so perhaps in terms of the sustainability of transportation modes, I might be the least sustainable today. I flew from there. I did take the blue line though, so in my defense, I put my part in there. But yesterday, Professor Susan mentioned about Texas and I-35. And so it's interesting because just this week, there was a post on Instagram inspiring people to treat yourself like I-35 and never stop working on yourself, no matter how inconvenient it is for anyone else, which I think is pretty interesting, pretty funny. It's a topic. And of course, people are talking about that. I freaking hate I-35. Is that how people are going to feel about me? Oh, they already completed 2 miles, but that doesn't matter. It's going to be there forever. And people just talking about how it takes, their entire adult life just seeing I-35, and it's an experience that, as you said, this week it was a topic of discussion. So anyway, that's not the topic of my talk today, but I just thought it was really, really funny. I'll talk about, a different set of examples that we have worked in our lab, both in Texas but also beyond, and 3 main things. It's the benefits about, challenges and opportunities for transportation electrification. That's the narrow slice of the pie that we're talking about today, especially for equitable outcomes. The first one is the benefits, air quality. I think we will have heard about them, but we'll try to quantify the impacts of this transportation transition into the grid. And then the last piece of the puzzle here that we're talking about is infrastructure. When we think about EV charging stations, how is Austin thinking about that? I'll end the last slide with a couple things beyond just electrification, just to plant the seed, because I know this workshop is meant to capture different ideas, and I would love to make sure that that's the case. Disclosure, when we think about equity from an academic perspective, there's a broad spectrum. Some academics focus a lot on the right-hand side. What this shows is just a spectrum of how much do you engage with communities. You can think about doing equity-oriented type of research, and you would be on the left-hand side of this figure, which is low type of engagement. You are investigator-driven type of research. Or you can be all the way, moving to the right-hand side and start to have community-engaged or community-based participatory research, and all the way to the right, there's community-driven research. So there's a broad spectrum that I think it's important to recognize as you are exposed to different flavors of academic research. In our lab, we do, a breadth, depending on the conversation on the topic, we position ourselves in one end of the spectrum and try to work towards the other one, but just put it out there. The first thing about air quality, as I mentioned, it's one example type of research that we did. We collaborated with Waze, the app, which is owned by Google now, United Nations, and then academia and government. And the question is, how can we start thinking about different policies? How can we help policymakers identify the things that will make them better in terms of PM 2.5 reduction? That's improvements in air quality. And so, we had information that it was on a street segment level every minute given to us, and we coupled to a motor vehicle emission model. That way we can understand if people are driving in a certain way, but if we switch the vehicle now to electric, what is the potential to reduce emissions? And we model different policies. You see 3 images here. This is for the greater Mexico City region, which is 20 million people. And so if you electrify taxis, this is how it would look. If you electrified the public transport system, like buses, this is how it would look. And then what if every light-duty vehicle in the city would be electrified? What's the potential reduction for PM 2.5, which is this green to blue color scale? And so through this exercise, we were able to provide some insights, and for a limited type of resources for any policymaker, they can then start making the correct decisions. And that was the point of this. We were able to elucidate this. We learned that these reductions can be highly localized depending on how people drive and the location of that pattern of driving. But also, you can add the time component. You can start thinking more, like broader. What if you start making time resolved policies? And I think London has this type of examples. But it also raises the question that if you want to avoid inequities, you have to have this broader planning process, not only policymakers early on, but also urban planners for the future, transit service providers as well. And so it just opens up the opportunity to do that. The next logical question is, okay, we're going to electrify transportation system, but what's going to happen with the grid? So that is one type of thing that we're looking at. There's the potential to reduce direct emissions that we just saw in the previous slide. But also as people start charging and you start having an increased amount of EVs connecting to the grid, that's going to affect grid planners, right? How are we going to be able to deliver that electricity in a reliable way? This question becomes even more complex as you start thinking about extreme weather events. And so the 2 things that we identify as immediate to understand is the composition of the grid, but also how people will be the way in which people start to charge. How is that going to be impacting also the dispatch of resources? So what I show here is just, not to go into much detail, but it's a dispatch curve, basically 2 scenarios. One where you have no EVs on the upper hand, or just the business as usual, not too much growth, bless you. And then you have another scenario down below, which you have, complete electrification, very aggressive penetration of EVs in this ERCOT, by the way, in Texas. And people don't have smart charging. It's just as you start your day, you start charging, or late at night. And the bottom line of this that I want to show is that, it impacts the grid. You can start having an increase in peaks, right? You can have a different type of shapes as well on the grid, which is a challenge for operators, but also a challenge for grid planning purposes, because you might have to start building your grid to meet that highest peak. But also it has other aspects to it, which you might be able to mitigate if you start having discussions about storage, batteries into the grid. Related to that, for the same amount of EVs, like whether we have medium penetration or like very aggressive EV deployment, depending on how you charge, that also impacts the need for transmission lines. And that's a very hot topic today. Last year, there was a full discussion about that. And this week, actually, FERC just issued a notice about transmission planning, which is a big, milestone. And so we wouldn't think that the way that people charge and the amount of EVs will be impacting this other huge discussion on transmission. But that's the point, I think it brings the questions that I just mentioned earlier about cohesive grid planning or planning as a whole, whether if it's urban planners or grid planners. It touches back again to the transportation system very quickly. Not only that, but we can also think about emissions. For the same amount of EV penetration, depending if it's medium or full, like aggressive, depending on how you charge can impact the amount of emissions. So the way that you dispatch your grid resources will be very different depending on how people are demanding that electricity, which opens up opportunities but also challenges because, back again, depending on how you dispatch and the need for resources, you'll be planning your grid differently. And you can have plans, power plants. You can start citing your power plants. Here is an example that we did for California. The pollutant dispersion will be very different. And so if you were planning to have a fleet of 10 natural gas power plants versus 12, and they're operated differently, the emissions or the pollutants from those plants will be impacting communities very differently, right? And so we start seeing now, we're trying to quantify the impacts, who's being hurt by pollution from plants that are coming from the need from EVs. And so it's a chain of events that, again, we don't think right when we plug, but it's as we think about increasing EVs and as we think about charging, someone down, in 300 kilometers or 200 miles away might be suffering the consequences from that. And so we're trying to quantify that. And again, it's a challenge, but also an opportunity to start thinking, about how we can start integrating grid planning into our discussions about EVs, but also looking at the policies for siting as well. And so it becomes very complex, very rapidly, I would say, but it's an opportunity back again. And the last thing, or the last example, is EV charging stations. I think Professor Transon gave a magnificent discussion this morning, very detailed, right? And so we've been thinking about that as well. In the context of Austin, the city of Austin has a climate equity plan. I don't know if Chicago has an equity or climate equity plan. It does? Okay, great. And so in the version from Austin, they're aiming to have 40% of the VMTs, vehicle miles travel, being done or coming from EVs. And they have explicitly stated that the charging stations must be placed strategically and equitably for a sustainable transportation transition. In fact, this is a screenshot from one of the council meetings, which they have explicitly here. Increase the number, the agenda item in this case, increase the number of direct current fast charging, DC fast charging stations for electric vehicles equitably throughout the city, right? And so it's stated as a mandate for them to do this equitably. But then the question is, when we approach them, hey, so how are you trying to do this? What's your approach to reflecting equity? I'll be eager to know how the climate equity plan here, if it touches on EVs or not. But I think that's a question that we're all thinking constantly, right? Like, how do we even start reflecting this into our planning purposes, into our models? And so our approach to do this, it's, let's start to reflect some of the socio-demographic indicators. In this case, we have social mobility, also equity indicators that reflect environmental conditions, but also beyond. And kudos also, or shout out to Professor Ria Contu. She's done a great amount of work in this. If you haven't checked her work at UIUC, she gave a little speech earlier today. So anyway, the point here is that we start with reflecting the current conditions and into the future. That's our baseline scenario. But also, we had conversations with the utility and asked them, okay, you have the mandate. Austin Energy is a municipal owned utility. You have the mandate from council to do this equitably, how you're doing this. And the conversations pretty much revolved around, okay, we think about prioritizing multifamily buildings. And we think it's going to be easier if we do it also if we expand in city-owned property. That's the least energy barrier that we can start putting our hands into it. And so we said, okay, fine, let's work with those scenarios, with what we think is the baseline, reflecting this condition, but also what we heard from you, which are the current priorities. And so at the end of the day, we have our final set of indicators that we weight for the most part at the same level. And we identified, I'm going to go very quickly for this, multifamily housing, how it's laid out across the city, so we can start prioritizing those regions as we layer on top of the other indicators. That's for scenario 2. Our other scenario, which is where they have the city-owned property, how to reflect that. Within the city-owned, there's so many, I learned that they have a lot of property, but we hone down on public parks, but also public libraries, as two potential type of sites. And we ended up with something that looks like this. We found ourselves also, as many of you, I don't know how many of you have used the CGEST tool from the Department of Energy or know about it. Show of hands. Okay, see some. EJ Screen from EPA. Okay, the Equity and Planning tool from DOT. Right. So there's so many, right? There's so many, and then we're developing our own to reflect the local circumstances. So what do we do? If we're trying to apply for funding for the city, which one should you use? And so our approach, this is fresh, like a few weeks ago. Okay, let's try to just overlay where does the EJ Screen, the CGEST, ours and the DOT tool overlaps, and it means then that those communities really, depending on the angle you come from, are really burdened, right? So that's what we did. We identified these locations here, some descriptors about their socioeconomic conditions, and so the question there is, okay, we have built these indicators, but what does it mean? What do they really need? What are the concerns? So we went and, surveyed them. We went on different locations in those specific regions. And what did we learn? First of all, that almost no one knows about the climate equity plan. So I don't know I'd love to know, what's the situation here, but at least that's something that we learned that, more than 80%, they don't know about it. They don't know about the rebates. So Professor Transick just mentioned, the need for that and also for have this on residential homes. But the challenge is, right, if people don't know about it, how are we going to be applying for it? So I think it starts raising interesting questions. Experience about EVs, a lot of them haven't had, but they would love to have access to an EV or just ride one. When you look at where the people living, the people we interviewed, they were mostly multifamily residents. They would be able or open to having a charging station near their home, but it would be ideal if it's in a commercial area. I'm just going through some of the results very quickly here. There are concerns, and they vary depending on whether single family or multifamily. Security is one that it's consistent, I would say, but also if it's cannibalizing parking availability in multifamily, that's an issue for residents of multifamily buildings. Increased traffic, we learned that also. We asked them, okay, where would you not like an EV charging station to be placed? And so one of the recurrent messages we got is that parks, because they feel like that's going to compromise the children's safety, which I would have never thought about that. And so I think it speaks about the limitations of these data-driven approaches that, as I mentioned early on, right? And there's a need to start, reaching and having these conversations because that's one of the things that we learned. Also, dangerous secluded areas because of safety, or hospitals as well. So key takeaways is, there's many takeaways, but commercial areas, it's important. There are many methods that are arising and indicators that can reflect different conditions. But we have to learn, how to strengthen the procedural justice, like having those voices being reflected in the type of work that we do. Last slide, because I ran out of time. Even if I didn't run out of time, this is the last slide anyway. I like to expand this conversation by just electric mobility. And this reflects two things or two challenges that we're seeing in the city of Austin. The first one is with jet fuel tank farms. This is the closest jet fuel tank farm in the US, the closest to a community, that is. So this is an aerial image of the airport, and they have placed a tank farm right here, and this is a community just across the street. And so, we're working with some community neighbors in there. There's some podcast episode that I recorded that I'll be releasing soon. But it just talks about the loopholes and the flawed process that, it expanded my vision about the legal process too. So I think, not sure there's a big takeaway there, but maybe there's some learnings because, there's going to be an increased need for the other modes of transportation, in this case, aerial transportation, but we have to think about the process too, and how to ensure that there's equitable procedures in place, right? So I think there's a lot of work for legal scholars to address in there. And then the other piece of discussion is, in Texas, we have the Giga Texas, the Giga site from Tesla, and I appreciate the supply chain mention, because what we're seeing is, there was already a legacy of fines in California, so they moved to Texas to expand some of their production. But there are multiple issues that were brought and that were surfacing as this happened. And so our lab forms part of a coalition with other local NGOs. It's called TOCA, Tesla Outreach Community Alliance. And so air quality is one of the concerns. And so as we think about producing or mass producing these vehicles that are good for our environment, broadly speaking for the environment, there are also issues for the members that are right next to these gigantic facilities. And so we can spend a lot talking about what we've learned in the process, but I just want to reflect this so we can have it in our minds as we think about electrification. There's a whole value chain behind this process too. So I'll conclude there. Happy to explore collaborations and appreciate again the invitation. Thanks. Thank you.
Any clarification question for Sergio? Okay, if not, then actually both presentations so far have really sort of highlighted sort of the opportunities quite a bit, and then also all the sort of implications that are hidden behind regarding the implications for the power system and also the public awareness. And then, so another piece of the puzzle actually that we're gonna bring to the table now is the state government's perspective on this electrification and other opportunities that we face. So I'm very pleased to introduce the first speaker, Jason Osborne. He is the director of the Office of Intermodal Projects Implementation at the Illinois Department of Transportation. He was named to the current position in 2022 after more than 20 years of experience in the transportation field. He has been an expert in long-range planning, project management, transportation policy, economic development, and public administration. Before joining IDOT, he worked in Metro, actually, our transit agency here in Chicago, leading system and performance analytics, Title VI conformity, and GIS development. So we're very happy to hear his IDOT's experience in sort of updating some of the projects here in the Chicago area. So Jason, please.
Thank you. Yeah, you got that presentation here.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for the warm welcome. I'm sure everybody's getting a little bit hungry. So thank you for the introduction, and I think this panel's been going great. Hopefully what I present today dovetails nicely into everything. So at the state level, there's quite a bit of work going on that I think that all the residents of Illinois should be proud of, and I think we're trying to establish something for the rest of the nation to replicate. When I talk old school, I just want to let you know something about me. I think real old school. So about 30 years ago, I was an art student, and I remember being outside of Madrid, and I saw this bridge off to the side of the highway, and it said, "All overweight trucks go this way." And it was a Roman bridge. So it was a Roman bridge cut with quadrum regularum, just regularly cut stone. I don't even know if the people building it were illiterate, right? So they built it, and it was been in place in a seismically active place for almost 2,000 years, and that's where they were having their heavy trucks go, right? I was an art student at the time, but I think in a way that pushed me into this field, like just the curiosity, how does that work? So I go old school, I think real old school, and I'm gonna highlight some things we're doing with railroad in Chicago. But I think our basic approach that I've been trying to do at IDOT is, obviously funding the partnerships and then leave a legacy in terms of what does that mean. So today, we've been asked to talk about, these major topics, and I'm going to try touching on them as best I can. So first, funding. We're really proud that the legislature was able to pass, back in 2019, a large $45 billion Rebuild Illinois program. And within that program, there was $4.6 billion in transit. Now, I'm not saying that's enough, but put that in context. That was more money than we, I think, had allocated from the state for like 40 years, the previous 40 years. So it's a historic shift in terms of, from a policy matter, what we're going to put our money towards. And we've been making good use of that. Everywhere possible, we've been using that money with the local transit agencies downstate as well as Northeastern Illinois to use that state funding to local match all the federal programs that have been pushed out at the same time. So having this bill in place in 2019 was perfect timing to leverage all those federal programs. So very proud of that. But money isn't everything. You can't really do much with money if you don't have people. And often a lot of the problems we have aren't, obviously money is a problem, but I just want to say it's having the right people in the room to actually make it work that is key. So let me talk to you about partnerships. You may or may not be aware of this program called CREATE in Chicago. And Jose alluded to it in terms of like, what is Chicago in terms of a freight hub? And sometimes I struggle with CMAP when we say we want to protect and maintain our priority as a hub, a freight hub of North America. It's like, look at all the impacts of that, both positive and negative. And it becomes almost an existential question. It's like, what? Do we really want all this here? But we do. And we can do it, and we can do all the above. But there's a lot of things that we can do better to make sure that as a freight hub, it really is working for everybody. So on the 75th Street Strip SIP project, this is a CRATE program. So let me take a step back and tell you about CRATE. CRATE is a very unique partnership that includes all the Class 1 railroads. It includes the state of Illinois, Cook County, City of Chicago, Amtrak, Metra. It includes, at the local level, the various communities that we're looking at grade separations. And so far to date, we've spent about $1 billion. So when you look at what we got for that $1 billion, and ask all the planners out there, all the modelers out there, how could you spend $1 billion to reduce the average train time going through Chicago by about 14 hours? So the rule of thumb before we started this project is they would take 2 days to get from the port of Long Beach to get to Chicago. It would take about 2 days to get through what we call the Chicago terminal, and then it would take 2 days to get to the East Coast. That was the basic math by which all the railroads in the United States operated. So much so that there's a lot of freight traffic in the Chicago region, industries along rail spurs where they do not use the rail spurs because it's much more efficient to put that on a truck, send it to where they need to go, Joliet, pointing to the right way, and then put it on rail, because the congestion in Chicago would just cost them so much time. So by taking it, we went from about 48, and now we're averaging actually about 32 hours. But it isn't just the time savings. So this is average freight train time savings. So think about the crew, the energy, the diesel that is just idling as it goes through the city of Chicago, reducing that by 14 to 16 hours on average. But we're just getting started. There's still a lot more to do. So the 75th Street SIP, you see, look at, this is the project area, but look at the CRATE project. And Jose had a map. You see where we're at. So this is all the areas of the city. These are the predominantly Black, Mexican, Asian neighborhoods of Chicago, right? It's also predominantly where all the White Sox fans are. I might add that too. But this is the part of the city where all the freight industry was at. This is all the projects we've been able to do. So we've been able to complete about half the projects on that bullet list over the last 10 years. So we're about halfway on it. But then there's this project, the 75th Street SIP, which is like a keystone project. And this is one of those major bottlenecks where the railroads from the east and the railroads from the west meet, and it's got to work out. But there's a lot going through here, including commuter rail, and it's important for passenger rail in the future. So when I talk old school, I just want to put this aside for efficiency. It's like you got to keep in mind how important it is, the barge and railroad, in terms of eliminating a lot of that truck traffic and how beneficial it is to make those systems efficient. Think about what that means in terms of diesel emissions. Yes, they're diesel locomotives, but they can handle as much as it would take 5 times as many trucks to do the same thing. And so when we talk about these benefits here, I think it's old school true, but it's here and it needs improvement. So that's all this slide is to show you. So the 75th Street SIP, it's about a 10 block by 10 block area. It's huge. We talk to people, civil engineers, normally you're talking about like 1 grade separation. And so it's interesting in Chicago, we always talk about viaducts because it's never one structure. It's always a series, maybe 10, 15, 20. We never have just one bridge structure. So it's just a series of viaducts. All that needs to be replaced. When we were doing the environmental study for this, first thing came up, say, hey, we have to mitigate this. We have to do more than just street improvements, which we're going to do. We got to do more than just lighting, which we're going to do, make this wider. Because right now in this area, I would consider the design criteria right now as kind of post-apocalyptic when you're underneath a viaduct. It's not necessarily the most comforting area to be, but it's railroad property. And railroad properties, they need this type of help to invest and make it better. But our focus is to replace all that too. But what happened during the EIS is that let me get my notes here. They asked us to focus on like education, like STEM, like this was going to be a specific thing that came out of that. And I'm going to skip those notes and not speed that. It was a combination of the CAG group and the elected officials. Really encouraging us, like, you have to go beyond this. You can't be spending billions of dollars in this neighborhood and nothing for us. There's what are we supposed to do? Just live with this construction? We've been living with this forever. And the partners in IDA, we committed ourselves to providing, a positive legacy, recognizing that, for generations, there's been a lot of unfortunate negative effects of this being in those neighborhoods. So in response to that, as far as like in the environmental record, of course, we're going to do the mobility improvements, including all the PED, light stuff. But we went beyond that, and we put together an educational program, a robust one. And so far, it's been about $600,000 that, with state and railroad money, we've put together. And that's in partnership with the Chicago Public School Libraries, Public Schools, Museum of Science and Industry, Daly College, and the city colleges of Chicago. And what we did is we've been working with the grade schools and high schools in the footprint of the project. It was like, okay, and what does that mean? Well, it's been a lot of fun, is what, kind of one way of looking at it. We pushed in a lot of technology in these classrooms in terms of like labs. You go into some of these classrooms, all you see is 3D printers. Like, I wish I went to high school here. This is really amazing stuff. Getting them involved in CAD, helping them understand, 3D virtual reality walk-arounds of the project, helping them aspire, not just from an educational standpoint, but help them understand the work that goes into designing this so that when they see the construction, they're fully aware of what it took and the careers and the career path it took to get there. So we had the lab programs, and we did STEM field trips, and this is one of the things as a planner, you just want to highlight that this job doesn't need to be boring. It can be exciting. So you want to do that. So commute all that money. Here's our friend from Norfolk Southern doing the 3D headsets that the kids kind of got lost in. But we didn't stop there. Several years ago, IDOT created a highway construction careers training program, and that program had been established to help develop careers in the highway construction industry in particular. But the CRATE partners got involved, and we decided to create a separate module just for the railroading industry. There wasn't enough like, okay, here's the education. Let's create a separate module building off of that and lead to careers. And so Roy right here, he's one of our graduates from this program. And he's currently working for CSX as a contractor. I think it's Granite Company, doing a lot of the concrete work for this P3 flyover that we're doing right now. When I say railroad flyovers, I'm talking about in Chicago, when we build interchanges for railroads. None of that's cheap. And if you get a chance to go down there, you'll see a massive amount of construction happening right now related to that. So that's the legacy part of what we tried to do. And when you go talk to U.S. representatives on Capitol Hill, we're talking about what is it that we're trying to do in Chicago. First, yes, there's the rail hub, where they've got major problems. Second, yes, we have this partnership that is super unique. It's really difficult to get this number of people around the table consistently for now almost 2 decades to solve these major problems. And then third, leaving behind a legacy in terms of a workforce, people in the community that understood why this was. And we believe that it might not be right for every single project, but those types of additional steps, especially when you're spending this much money, are worthwhile. Go beyond just your normal public input and leaving behind that legacy. Well, thank you.
Great, thank you. Any questions? We move on to our last but not the least speaker, Mr. Obui Reed. He is president and CEO of the Ethnicity, racial equity movement. He works globally as a racial equity tactician, increasing mobility advocate, and also racial justice activist. His passion lies in the intersection of community, culture, and health, with an extensive background in both nonprofit management and corporate social responsibility. He is most proud of his work to create a diverse coalition of people, organizations, and business, all working together to achieve racial equity and mobility justice across the city of Chicago. So I think he represents the last piece of the puzzle that we're trying to sort of hear from, is essentially the community-based organization perspective. So please join me in welcoming him.
All right. New policies, new systems, new moves. Operationalizing racial equity in sustainable transportation. Hello, everyone. My name is Obai Olatunji Obai Reed. I am the founding president and CEO of the Equiticity Racial Equity Movement. Here's my contact information in case anyone wants to get in touch with me. The link and the QR code at the bottom of this presentation will take you to this presentation. And you'll be able to access the many links in the presentation at your own leisure. I would love to begin by offering a special thank you to Elizabeth Murphy, Luis Rodriguez, and Juan Salamanca, and the extended UIUC and UIC family. It's been a pleasure working with you all over the past several months to make this moment a reality, and I look forward to our continued work together. Equiticity is a racial equity movement operationalizing racial equity by harnessing our collective power through research, advocacy, programs, community mobility rituals, and social enterprises to improve the lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in our society. Equiticity's vision is a mid to large-size U.S. city where racial equity is fully integrated at the policy and legislative levels into every function, department, resource, and budget associated with the city's operations, services, and programs. We envision Equiticity creating a U.S. city which serves as a global model for the rest of the world on showcasing how to normalize, prioritize, and operationalize a full-throated, unflinching commitment to racial equity as an equitably moving flow of resources contributing to reducing violence, improving health, creating jobs, and ultimately making our neighborhoods and our cities more livable for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. By way of us grounding in an unfortunate reality, I will read two brief parts of this quote. Urban transit systems in most American cities, for example, have become a genuine civil rights issue and a valid one because the layout of rapid transit systems determines the accessibility of jobs to the Black community. There is only one possible explanation for this situation, and that is the racist blindness of city planners. Does anyone know who said those words? Dr. King. These words were written by Dr. King in an essay entitled A Testament of Hope, posthumously published in January of 1969. The unfortunate reality is that over 55 years later, we are still experiencing the same racialized inequities of transit systems in cities across the U.S. which do not serve the needs of racially marginalized communities. The same may be said for walking, biking, shared mobility, and emerging transportation technologies. Implicit in me being invited to serve on this panel, and explicit in the title of my remarks, New Policies, New Systems, New Moves, Operationalizing Racial Equity and Sustainable Transportation, is the acknowledgement far too many of our communities and cities across the country are inequitable for racially marginalized people and in need of urgent transformation. Also implicit in our time together here is the unfortunate reality that the systems, structures, and institutions which make up our society are the foremost purveyors of structural racism and racialized inequities. We must all reckon with our individual and institutional contributions to these inequities and the injustices experienced by racially marginalized people. We must all reckon with these four fundamental truths. Number one, the root causes of all injustice experienced by Black, brown, and indigenous people in our society are structural racism and racial capitalism. Number two, our oppression was and is by design. Number three, the most important work we must do is the dismantling of structural racism and racial capitalism and the rebuilding of our society where Black, brown, and indigenous people thrive. Number four, freedom is inevitable and is coming. Who are we serving and why? As a transportation sector, are we primarily serving white, wealthy men who commute to work on their bikes and are part of the social mainstream in our society? Are we primarily serving white working class people using transit to commute to work downtown? Are we serving these communities for pure financial and political motives? Or are we intentionally serving racially marginalized people who feel compelled to own a car or use transit as their only viable options? Are we serving racially marginalized people who are the most in need of increased mode share for cycling and walking? Are we serving these communities to improve life outcomes? A one-size-fits-all model does not work in communities beset by inequities and injustice. Serving marginalized communities requires specific strategies and tactics, reflecting our unique identity, culture, history, and needs. Serving these communities also requires the transportation sector to see our mere humanity, imbued with the inherent God-given human right to live free and prosper. I want to focus on a few strategies and tactics, namely what I refer to as new policies, new systems, and new moves. New policies represent the institutional infrastructure which guides decision-making. New systems represents the products of this decision-making. New moves represent the results of our collective work. Let's start with new policies, focusing here only on Equiticity's racial equity statement of principle. Our statement of principle defines and envisions racial equity and describes the guiding principles which make up an unflinching and full-throated commitment to racial equity. The framework articulates an operational implementation of racial equity which will be transformative for Black, brown, and indigenous communities. Racial equity is the fair, just distribution of resources, explicitly targeting and prioritizing racially marginalized people as the groups who have the greatest needs due to being systematically disenfranchised, and using these resources to address both historical and contemporary injustices, as well as to remove inequities and improve life outcomes. Racial equity is focused on Black, brown, and indigenous populations as the racially marginalized communities here in the U.S. I encourage you all to explore the embedded links here pointing to key frameworks, shaping policy, and Equiticity's research articulating the severity of needs. I implore you all to explore how we operationalize these frameworks and center community-led research. Next, let's discuss new systems, focusing here on Equiticity's Mobility Opportunities Fund. As seen in the opening video, which we didn't see, MOF is a financial incentives program designed to help limited income Black and brown residents purchase climate-friendly transportation, including conventional bicycles, electric cargo bikes, and electric vehicles. Equiticity distributed about $250,000 to over 250 residents in the North Lawndale neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. Voucher programs such as this, led by governments and/or CBOs, drive adoption of conventional bikes, e-bikes, e-cargo bikes, and electric vehicles for people who may not otherwise afford bikes, and especially e-bikes and EVs. Next, let's discuss new moves, focusing here on community ownership. Marginalized communities must own the planning processes impacting our neighborhoods and our cities. We must work in full partnership with government agencies envisioning, planning, and executing transportation plans across all modes of travel in our communities. We must be compensated for this ownership and partnership, and we must share power and decision-making. We don't create racially equitable environments because someone in the right position at the right time has a good heart. We do not leave a commitment to racial equity, mobility justice, and environmental justice to people with good hearts. Good hearts and warm bodies come and go. Goofy smiles and awkward handshakes come and go. Shifting political winds come and go. We policy and operational commitment to mobility justice and environmental justice. We legislate an operational commitment to racial equity. This policy and legislative strategy ensures these commitments are more durable, long-lasting, and impactful. We are not of the opinion that systems, structures, and institutions which harm us have an inherent right to exist. One of my favorite people is Marlo Stanfield from HBO's The Wire. He once told someone, "You want it to be one way, but it's the other way." To those systems which continue to do us harm, we say, burn it down and build anew. What happens when we turn on the power and equity moves like electricity through our homes, our streets, our neighborhoods, and our cities? Equiticity. Power plus equity is greater than. As you all leave this panel, and later today, we all leave this conference, I ask you all to do this one thing for me. Turn on the power and let equity flow. Here's my contact information again in case anyone wants to get in touch with me. Reminder, the link and the QR code at the bottom of this slide will take you to this presentation where you'll be able to access all of the embedded links. And should you get the presentation, you'll be able to see this video. Thank you all.
Very, very thought-provoking presentations from all our speakers.